Hi, I'm Kerry Decker, and over the past few sessions, we've been talking about critical race theory and trying to get a better understanding of that so that we can sort through our thoughts and be better equipped to share this information with others. And so today we want to just wrap everything up and spend some time on our reflections or with our reflections about critical race theory. We'll be right back. Hey, Leroy, welcome to the broadcast. I'm glad you're able to join us.
Hey, Kerry, it's good to see you again. Glad to be here.
Yeah, hey, give us the quick elevator pitch description of what critical race theory is.
Critical race theory is a derivative of critical theory, in which and through which the adherent to critical race theory is uh, seeing the world through the lens of race, seeing every aspect of our culture, every aspect of relationship through the lens of race. It literally is that.
Hmm.
And it is, as I was saying off camera, it is a new way of seeing dealing with race in our country. It is
Yeah,
a brand new way, and we just in a way in which we're not familiar with.
yeah, that's for sure. So let's go through and we'll recap or at least reflect a little bit on what we've been talking about over the last few episodes and go through some of these concepts. And one of the things that I think that we've seen pretty clearly is that critical race theory is divisive or divisive, depending on how you want to say it. Some say potato, some say potato. But what it ultimately does is it pits us against each other.
Hmm.
That and that whites are the oppressors and people of color are the oppressed, and all whites are racist, and all people of color cannot be racist by the definition of critical race theory, just simply because within critical race theory, that the whole concept of race is prejudice plus power, and so
Hmm.
whoever controls the power in a culture is by definition the ones who can be who are racist. And so let's go through a few of these slides. Of course, one of the great spokespersons for critical race theory is Robin DiAngelo, and she says that all white people are invested in and collude with racism. So all white people, so regardless of your circumstances, is that just by virtue of your skin color, and I think that that's one of the things that makes critical race theory so divisive, is that it reinstates essentially a way of thinking about people rather than as individuals. That if you're part of a particular class, then by definition, you're racist. And if you're part of another class, by definition, you are oppressed, no matter how much money or status that you may have or how much influence that you may have, is that you are nevertheless oppressed as a result of that. So that um, it also assigns people to categories, and even though critical race theory is rooted in postmodernism and relativism, is that it's highly dogmatic in the way it thinks about the world, and also it's highly dogmatic when it comes to morality. Is that if you do not embrace the critical race theory paradigm for thinking, then you're
Hmm.
morally defective. You know?
Yeah, I think that um, if you when you think about critical race theory, it is a derivative of this idea called critical theory. What
Yeah.
critical theory does is it brings together, it's a multidisciplinary critique of society or culture. I mean, when I say multidisciplinary, I mean sociological, psychological,
Mm-hmm.
law, education. all these particular facets are brought to bear, and when they're brought to bear, they don't just sit there. They actually are allowed to do what they do in order to accomplish their goals. Now, if the goal if you believe from the very outset that power is at the base and root of every single relationship,
Yeah.
then you have to find some way of overturning that power. And what we just saw is a multifaceted approach to doing that. The first
Mm-hmm.
approach is to stoke resentment between blacks and whites, or whites and non-whites. The first approach is to stoke resentment and to leverage what are termed disparate or differences within cultures and within society, and to leverage
Yeah.
those differences in order to bring division. And
Mm-hmm.
another facet of that is to forever link people into groups based on their mutable characteristics like race.
Yeah.
So whites, no matter how affirming they are, like Robin DiAngelo, are racist. So
Yeah.
Robin DiAngelo defines racism in such a way as to say that all whites collude to pursue power. Now let's take that to its logical conclusion. If all whites are in collusion to um, uh, to maintain power, how is Robin DiAngelo's whiteness being used in order to maintain power for
Yeah.
herself? Well, she's
Yeah.
tricked her victims, and I do mean victims.
Mm-hmm.
She's tricked her victims into thinking that she's an ally. But if you really understand DiAngelo, she says that whites can't be out. Whites and blacks can't literally be equals. They have to. They're always going to be in an oppressor relationship. And
Mm-hmm.
an ally on that view is someone who must agree with the oppressed, um, but is never equal or on par with those who are oppressed. So
Yeah. Yeah.
holding her accountable to her own ideas, we have to ask that question: how is she using her whiteness to benefit from? And I think she's doing that to the tune of millions of dollars a year.
Yeah. Yeah. She's, has this kind of little cottage industry going on, fomenting this particular view of race and racial disparities. And as a result, that it's has been pretty profitable for her. So, and it's interesting to me. You're a critic of critical race theory, as am I, and but it's interesting to me that as a person of color, you're considered to be morally defective because you do not buy into
Yeah.
the uh, the philosophy itself.
Well,
So,
I, it's very interesting. So when I think of this concept of worldview, for example,
mm-hmm.
I think foundation to every biblical worldview is our view of God. Second, I
Yeah.
think the second level is how we know and what we value and what's ultimate. And that third level would be what we think is right. And then that last level would be how we live
Mm-hmm.
together. Now, the way that I construe the world, the way that I see the world, is I have this biblical view of God who says that He created from one man all man, and that there's
Yeah.
only one race of people in the world. So if I have this biblical view that not only affirms what God has said, but makes it authoritative in my life, then I'm not free to see other people as better or worse than I am. I'm not free
Mm-hmm.
to label people on the basis of their immutable characteristics as
Yeah.
oppressor or non-oppressor. I have to judge each man or woman on the content of their character, rather than those characteristics in which they could do nothing about.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in that view, I don't think that I could never hold Robin DiAngelo's view or any other view that that derives from some other basis for seeing the world or way of seeing
Yeah.
the world.
Yeah. And in one respect, it's not just the content of character, but it's just the fact that all human beings are made in the image of God, even
Right.
those with bad character.
Essentially.
you know?
Yeah. No, that's true. That's 100% right. Essentially, their essence,
Yeah.
being made in the image of God, connotes value on
Mm-hmm.
every single person, even what we would deem wicked or bad people. They are of an inestimable worth because they're made in God's image,
Yeah.
which means that for those of us who love the Lord and those of us who affirm His word, Paul says that we have to endeavor to judge no man after the flesh, and I
Mm-hmm.
think that's our mandate. That's our perspective when it comes to it. It doesn't mean that we're naive about people.
Yeah.
Quite the contrary. We know that men are sinners, but at the same
Mm-hmm.
time, that means that I'm not free to from the outset to label or classify a group of people as wicked or evil. Or
Yeah.
more wicked or more evil than another group of people, just on the basis of their immutable characteristics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so let's move on with this. Is that one of the things that if you're going to be a good person, well, within the framework of a critical race theory, you have to engage. You must engage in anti-racism the rest of your life. And one of the things that we need to be clear on is with this is that they have this special terminology, and they've assigned particular meanings to this terminology. And so, people say, yeah, well, I'm against racism. I must be anti-racist. But that's not really what they mean by it. Let's just read what it says here. Is that Ibram X. Kendi says, the opposite of racist isn't not racist, it's anti-racist. What's the difference? Well, one either allows racial inequities to persevere as a racist or confronts racial inequities as an anti-racist. And essentially, the whole idea of confronting the of the inequalities there or inequities is based within the framework of how critical race theory would see this. And so we also see that for as a person of color, is that you, according to critical race theorists, have a false consciousness, which
Mm-hmm.
means that that you've internalized and identified with attitudes and ideology of the controlling class.
Mm.
And so there really is, there really is, I guess, a contempt that we see both for whites and for people of color, particularly people of color who don't march in step with the dictums of critical race theory. And so,
Yeah, yeah, it's just a very interesting way to see people. Ultimately, I'm not black because I don't think the way that they want me to think,
mm-hmm,
and that's very interesting. Um, I think I brought this up in an earlier episode. How C.S. Lewis says that that's called bulverism on his view. It's where
yeah,
we attempt to argue for a position while at the same time denying another person the right to argue for their position. So this kind of
mm-hmm,
false consciousness or the use of this kind of concept is meant to prevent them from having to deal with my ideas and deal with me on the level of an individual who thinks rather than the level of an individual who must conform. So
yeah,
rather than deal with the content of my ideas or the truthfulness of my ideas and show me where I'm
mm-hmm,
wrong, they attempt to browbeat me and denigrate me into a position where I just accept their view so as not to
mm-hmm,
be seen as someone who is identifying with the controlling class. And I simply say, look, if your ideas are so great, let's meet on the battlefield of ideas and then let's debate that. But
yeah,
to try to argue for a position and then attempt to morally or mentally shame me for the ideas that I hold, it just
mm-hmm,
won't do it. I mean,
yeah,
reasonable people, thinking people just won't give in to such ideas. And I
yeah.
think weak minded people do give in to those ideas.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I agree. It's kind of a form of philosophical gaslighting, you know. And so,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
but,
Absolutely. That
but
is absolutely what it is.
yeah. So let's move on here. And what it is, it's a Kafka trap. I just heard that the other
Mhm.
day, and I said, oh well,
Mhm.
what's that about? In other words, if you're accused of being racist or having a false consciousness or anything else or white supremacist, and you deny it, well, then that's proof of your guilt.
Right.
So
That's
there's,
that's like the old question, and it is a crude
yeah,
statement where you say, when did you stop beating your wife? You know what I mean?
yeah, yeah,
That's the
yeah,
kind of statement that is. To say,
yeah,
wait a minute, I've never done that, is to say, well, you've never stopped doing it, right? It's just but
yeah,
I think what you're really getting at, and I think this is really important for viewers,
mm-hmm,
is that once you understand that this is a multidisciplined approach, and a large portion of it is psychological,
mm-hmm,
there these folks have sat around and thought through these issues, and what they've put in place are ways to help people entrap you in your thinking, to first entrap you emotionally.
yeah,
Second, to entrap you because 9 times out of 10 you've been going about your life, thinking about your own life, and now it is to entrap you in a set of ideas, so that they can cause you to conform emotionally rather than thoughtfully. The whole
mm-hmm,
point of being an anti-racist, is to move those people who say something that we've always said, which is, I want to be colorblind. To be colorblind is not to say that there are no such things as color. It's to
mm-hmm,
say that I'm not going to allow someone's color to prevent me from having a relationship with them or treating them as an equal. That's what we've always meant by colorblind. But what they've construed colorblind to mean is that,
yeah,
oh, you don't really see race, which is no one has ever believed that. That's just new and thoroughly ahistorical and somewhat nonsensical.
yeah,
But we have to be
yeah,
strong-minded people who see through these methods as it's thoroughly psychological, thoroughly sociological, and I say sociological because that's where the redefinition comes in. The
yeah,
sociologist defines and redefines reality in order to force people to accept this new reality without thinking about why. So these new definitions come about in order to herd people down a particular path. So you're not free to love your black neighbor or your white neighbor as just a friend who lives next door to you. You must see these people in terms of power, and oppressor and oppressed. You must see them that way, and
yeah,
they must force you to see that way, so
yeah,
that they can get you into their particular system and set of schemes.
yeah, yeah. Let's move on with the slides here. It says so. The claim of not racist, according to Kendi, is so the claim of not racist neutrality is a mask for racism, and that and it also what critical race theory essentially cultivates additional grievance groups. We read here that critical race theory works towards the end of eliminating racial oppression as part of the broader goal of ending all forms of oppression. Racial oppression is experienced by many in tandem with oppressions on the grounds of gender, class, or sexual orientation. And so there's, it becomes a host of essentially identities that now have to be, the cause of all of these identities have to be picked up, and that you have to kind of carry the banner and
So
carry their banner essentially.
yeah, so imagine now, we're Christians. We live in society,
Mm-hmm.
and imagine now, as a Christian, instead of being uh, neutral towards, and neutral in this sense, that I'm going to let my neighbor live as he or she pleases, to the extent that they can. I mean, that's
Yeah, yeah,
what we do. Now imagine me becoming an anti-sinner. Now what does that mean? That means that now I have to get on my horse and be
yeah,
against every sin known to man, and be an activist
yeah, yeah, yeah.
against every sin known to man. That's exactly the kind of concept that they're asking. Because why just racism?
Mm-hmm.
Why not any other sin? Why not all sin altogether?
Yeah.
Why must my whole life be oriented toward being anti-racist? Racism is just one more sin in the
Mm-hmm.
world. Why not just be? Let's just throw off this one thing and say let's be against sin as a whole, and be no longer neutral toward my neighbor's sin. How's that going to work? What do you
Yeah.
think that is going to do?
Yeah.
How is society going to bend toward that? And that's kind of like,
Yeah.
the foolishness of this. Yeah, I'm going to be anti-racist insofar as um, I am going to be a good neighbor. I am
Mm.
going to be open to dinner and lunches and conversations and friendships with
Yeah.
people who don't look like me. I'm not required to be an activist,
Mm.
and it doesn't mean that I'm all of a sudden neutral toward racism. It's just a canard. No, I'm not called, believe it or not, to change the entire world. No, that's no Christian's burden at
Yeah.
all. What I am
Yeah.
called is to be a change agent in the place where I am. And what does that mean to me? I
Mm-hmm.
am going to walk as a dearly loved child and be an imitator of Christ.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm
Yeah.
going to remember that I'm beloved by God. And insofar as I remember those things, I'm going to love people. That's how I
Mm-hmm.
become an anti-racist. Is I love people. I'm not going on a crusade against racism. And some people might say, well, why are you having this conversation? Because my brothers and sisters need to be awakened to this once and for all given truth that the scriptures have given us about our role in this world, and
Yeah.
to which other people in the church have kind of forgotten. They've made
Mm.
racism their particular hobby horse in America above all every other sin in the world. And what's very interesting is that they are not hostile to like abortion,
Mm-hmm.
the same way that they want us to be hostile to racism. They're not hostile to homosexuality, the same way that they want us to be hostile to racism. They're not hostile to any of those particular sins. As a matter of fact, they will go out of their way to call me a religious fundamentalist, to be hostile against, as a pejorative, right? In a
Mm-hmm.
negative way, to be
Mm-hmm.
hostile against those two sins. So why just racism? Why not every sin?
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and and this is because they've been using race as a lever or a cudgel to force people into this new way of seeing the world. And I think that that's incredibly problematic from a biblical standpoint.
Yeah, and also it's a question of authority, and they've set themselves up as the ultimate authorities, the arbiters
Right,
of what's
right.
right and wrong. And so what we say is good, and you better jump on that bandwagon. And
Hmm.
these other things, well, you're just a religious fundamentalist if you are concerned about those things. So, and that comes to the point of who gets to decide. Well, at the end, and you've mentioned this many times before, this is all about power, who can
Right,
control society, and
right.
because the ones that control society are the ones that essentially that determine what's the sufficient remedy for racism, and that it's always going to be made in their image and according to their particular point of view. So, so
There's
not
always
only
going to be
go
a
ahead,
group who is excluded. There's always going to
yeah,
be a group that is excluded on their particular view. And on their view, the group that is excluded is the group that does not adhere to their particular tenets of
mm-hmm,
their faith,
exactly,
their newfound faith. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So not only is it divisive, but it's also deceptive, and I
Hmm.
think that critical race theory really is like a Trojan horse, that it hides what it really is about. And one thing that critical race theory does is it undermines truth. That because and it's so ironic because it sprang from postmodernism and kind of a whole approach that there is no objective truth, but and there's no objective truth that's knowable except for critical race theory or critical studies. We've
Hmm.
arrived at the proper lens through which to view society, and everything else is false. So,
Yeah. The critical race theorist will use whatever it can to prevent itself from being critiqued.
yeah,
If
exactly.
if
Yeah.
if relativism if
Mm-hmm.
relativism works for the critical race theorist, then they will have you denying biology. A man is
Mm-hmm.
a woman and a woman is a man. If that's the method that they particularly choose, If nihilism, they want
Mm-hmm.
to destroy or tear down, they will use deconstructionism. They will get you to tear down society. But in all these methods that they use, they never tell you what they want to put in its place.
Yeah.
The only truth that can be known is there was something bad that happened 200 years ago, and from that
Mm-hmm.
bad event, and it was an egregious event,
Oh, of course.
um,
Yeah.
egregious. From that bad event, the argument then is that every other thing that is wrong with society flows from that.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
um, are there issues that continue on? Yes. And here's what
Yeah.
we ought to say to that. We ought to say that insofar there are issues that continue on, we as a society should vote them out, should tear those laws down, should remove
Mm-hmm.
any of those structures that do that. But you have to first point out where they are,
Yeah.
and you have to
Yeah.
demonstrate, you know, rightly that these are the root causes. And I don't think that they've done that. I don't think that
No.
they've done it at all.
Yeah.
Um,
Exactly. Exactly. Well,
I mean, take this one last point. Take for example
yeah.
the idea of redlining. Redlining is illegal.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Redlining is illegal, and when
Mm-hmm.
you really study neighborhood patterns, on average in America, people live no more than 2 to 4 years in the same neighborhood.
Hmm.
So whatever happened in a neighborhood that was redlined 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 70 years ago, the people who lived in those neighborhoods more than likely moved 2 years, 5 years. Within 10 years, no
Yeah.
one who was there for the initial redlining lived in those neighborhoods. It isn't to say that redlining didn't have an effect, but what it is to say is that those people who lived in those neighborhoods, who were the original victims, more than likely moved on and to live at different places. And redlining didn't
Mm-hmm.
exist all over the country. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
So, another way that critical race theory is deceptive is that essentially it undermines equality and
Hmm.
replaces it with equity. Now,
Right.
I like what James Lindsay said. He says most people would probably assume that social justice is primarily interested in equality and in creating a fair society in which everyone gets equal opportunity. And he says that they would be sorely mistaken. Equity, and I like what you said before about equity, how that it's equity over equality in critical race theory. So equity comes first, and that's really the primary concern in
Yeah.
critical race theory.
Yeah, we all want equality,
Hmm.
and we all want equal opportunities for
Yeah.
everyone. I think that's what it means to be, a fair society. We want equal opportunities, and equal opportunities means that everyone gets to compete for a
Hmm.
job or for some status. You get to compete for that. But equity says that we all need to have the same outcomes.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
that's just impossible for each of us to have the same outcomes because we don't all have the same smarts. We don't all
Yeah.
have the same work ethic. We don't all even take advantage of all the opportunities that we're given. And,
Hmm.
and we all can't have the same outcomes.
Yeah.
Um, it doesn't mean that we don't want the opportunity. We don't want. It doesn't mean that we don't want students who come from disadvantaged
Hmm.
neighborhoods to be able to be trained up or get the remedial learning that they need so that they can compete. Yeah, we want to do that. That's what it means to be a fair society. That means that's what we do when we want to make sure that our children, get a
Yeah.
fair opportunity. But we cannot guarantee that all of our children will have the same outcomes,
Exactly.
the same
Yeah.
opportunities. Absolutely,
Yeah.
but the same outcomes. That's just a different world than we live in.
Yeah. Yeah. So equality is about equal opportunity. Equity is about equal outcomes. So equality is concerned with the starting line, and equity focuses on the finish line, and that everybody
Hmm.
should kind of, and it's kind of the outgrowth of you know the generation where everybody gets the trophy, and
Right.
but life doesn't work that way.
A couple of years ago, I saw this Instagram post, and there was this famous NFL football player who retired,
Yeah.
and his sons were going out to play. His little kids were going out to play football, and their team lost, and they came home with participation trophies. And he says, "You know what this is?" He said, "This is a participation trophy." He opened up the trash can, took both of those trophies his son won, and threw them in the trash because. And he said that is not the way the world works. No,
Yeah.
you're competing to win,
Mm.
and you're not competing for the sake of competing. That's called exercise. It's exercise. We're trying to win, and everybody ought not feel good. I mean,
Yeah.
I was a high school football coach, and the only time you feel good is if you win, and then you ought to feel good if you played your heart out. But if you didn't
Yeah.
play your heart out, take part in the victory, absolutely, but think through how you can better your efforts the next time that we play.
Yeah. Yeah. For
But
sure.
they're threatening to overturn all that by saying
Mm.
there's no need for competition. We're just going to let everybody win, and once everybody wins, there are no losers ever, right?
Yeah.
And really there are no winners,
Except for the
because to win
politicians.
exactly
Yeah.
there,
Yeah.
there, yeah, there are no winners either. It's
Yeah.
just what
Yeah. So it'd be the overlords that are the winners. So
yeah
that so the way to achieving equity, as we talked about before, is coercion, and
right
that it just is incompatible with a free society. And so and that really brings us to the next point, is that where critical race theory undermines democracy. And I was surprised that Richard Delgado, one of the leaders in advancing critical race theory, and maybe I shouldn't be surprised by this, but he says critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order.
Mhm.
In liberal order, we're talking about, like the democratic way of doing life. And he says that we question those, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. And so
yeah
it's really,
Delgado believes that liberal. And when we say liberal, we don't mean liberal in terms of conservative and liberal or
mm-hmm,
democratic liberal. What we mean are those values that are necessarily for well functioning democracy, which is like fairness and equality and
yeah,
individual rights. So that's called classical liberalism. So what
yeah,
Delgado believes are that people who hold to that kind of classical liberalism, and believe it or not, 1940s, 1950s, there was a competition between Republicans and Democrats over who best embodied liberal
hmm,
values. I mean,
hmm,
that is a well noted reality. But they wouldn't have articulated liberal in our common understanding of liberal. But in that
yeah,
real sense, where we were one of equality and freedom. So what Delgado is arguing is that people who enshrine in rationalism and the Enlightenment rationalism and natural laws and property rights, right? Property rights.
mm-hmm, yeah, that's a
All
big
these
one.
things are done on Delgado's view to uphold white supremacy. Because remember,
Hmm,
we talked about white supremacy is not the KKK, Ku Klux Klan marching around with capes and burning torches. No, in their view, white supremacy is that all of reality, all of society is geared to ensure that white people win and are
yeah,
supreme. So Delgado would say that any values, any liberal values or any conservative values, any values that continue this direction or
hmm,
this way of seeing the world ought to be torn down. That's what Delgado
yeah.
means.
Yeah, I think that it's roughly equivalent. White supremacy is with Western civilization,
Yeah, I
and
agree.
you
Yes.
know that, and so that's really what they're hoping to overthrow. Critical race theory, according to Glory Ladson Billings, says she writes that critical race theory argues that racism requires sweeping changes, but liberalism has no mechanism for such change. And so, if you kind of decode what she seems to be saying there, is that the sweeping changes means to get rid of the whole liberal order that
Right.
has been the foundation of a Western civilization,
Yeah.
for forever.
And not just the liberal order that has been the foundation for Western civilization. How about this? And we
Hmm.
have evidence of this in our own time. They even want the leftist kind of liberalism destroyed. Let me give you an example. Remember during Donald Trump's first presidency,
Yeah.
you had all the women's marches that
Hmm.
were just, every year there was these insane women's marches. Well, remember the women's marches imploded. Why? Because the non-white feminist came out against the white feminist and
Hmm.
began to argue over power structures within that feminist movement, and that whole movement imploded because those who were holding to more of a critical race theory perspective were saying that non-white feminists ought to be at the forefront of this movement, which denigrated, removed, crushed those white liberal women, feminists who were deeply involved and embedded in the movement. So, you have first, second, and third wave feminism. Now, this fourth wave feminism is more of a critical kind that does not have place for the traditional white liberal
Hmm.
in its ranks, other
Yeah.
than that proverbial allyship where they just agree um, with uh, uh, the new critical theorists. So
Yeah.
that's an example from our time.
Hmm. Hmm. Another way that they are deceptive is that it really undermines language, and we already touched a little bit on this. But with respect to white supremacy, here's what Robin DiAngelo writes. She says, "Remember, when I use the term white supremacy, I do not use it to refer to extreme hate groups. I use the term to capture the pervasiveness, magnitude, and normalcy of white dominance and assumed superiority." And
Hmm.
so it's and time and time again, even I've heard that if people of color who don't agree with critical theorists, I've heard people of color be called white supremacists. So
Yeah, that's what they mean. I mean, think about that. Your Dave Chappelle's, regardless of whether
yeah,
we agree with him politically or not, he's a white supremacist. Kyrie Irving is a white supremacist. Uh, you name the black person who is Ben Carson is a white
yeah,
supremacist. Why? Because what they mean by white supremacy is that their views uphold uh, the normalcy or Western values, if you will. Not to
hmm,
say that they uphold Christian values, but their views are seen as heteronormative and ought to be done away with. And that
yeah,
is, so they're using white supremacy in a whole different way
yeah,
that we're not used to using it. And I
hmm,
would also add that it is that new language and that new way of expressing their ideas which allows them to make arguments that we're not used or capable or prepared to counter, right?
yeah,
Because
yeah,
we're not talking about the same thing. If
hmm,
you think that white supremacy is extreme hate groups, then you're not really prepared to be in this discussion with people who say that hard work and logic and
yeah,
reason
yeah.
are white supremacists.
Yeah, exactly. And racism, again, one of the critical theorists writes, racism, while racial and cultural prejudice and discrimination supported by institutional power and authority, used to the advantage of whites and the disadvantage of people of color. Racism encompasses economic, political, social, and institutional actions and beliefs that systematize and perpetuate an unequal distribution. And there's that whole idea of everybody gets an equal share,
Hmm.
unequal distribution of privileges, resources, and power between whites and people of color. So, again, the terminology gets shifted, and and so we're not talking about the same things, and so
Right.
obviously we can't have a meaningful discussion when the terminology is
So radically different.
yeah,
and uh,
yeah,
and there is a power that comes. from that, you're learning a whole new language. You're learning a whole new way of expressing yourself and expressing what you perceive to be a problem, in which
Mm-hmm.
the people who would disagree with you are often incapable of, unprepared to, and not knowledgeable enough to debate with you. So
Yeah.
ultimately, you have an almost upper hand in the debate because folks aren't really prepared to have that discussion. So when they say let's have the conversation, there's almost an intimidation from people who haven't thought about this because
Mm-hmm.
I'm not really prepared to have that conversation the way that you want to have it. I'm
Yeah.
prepared for the old one because we've been having that conversation, but the new conversation is to rethink all these different ways in which our institutions function. On this new level of racism that is more structural rather than skin color oriented.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So finally, that CRT is dangerous, at least in my view, because it really what it does is it seeks to defund, dismantle, and reimagine social institutions in its image. And what it does is that it has even worked its way into education. I kept hearing from different folks, well, this is just something that is a is
A
a
fad.
concern in law school, and
Hmm.
that and it's not it doesn't show up in and certainly not in K through 12. And so I was doing a little research on it, and here is what Kimberly Crenshaw, she's the person who coined the term critical race theory, and she says that critical race theory originated in law schools, okay, but over time, professional educators and activists in a host of settings, K through 12 teachers, DEI advocates or diversity, equity, and inclusion advocates, racial justice and democracy activists, and among others. But she specifies that K through 12 teachers have are promoting critical race theory, and she says elsewhere that it can claim a presence in education, psychology, cultural studies, political science,
Right.
and even philosophy. So I did a little bit more research on this, and I came across a document by the National Education Association, which is the largest organization that represents public school teachers. And they acted on and adopted a new business item 39. And when you read that, here's what it says: share and publicize through existing channels information already available on critical race theory, what it is and what it's not, and have a team of staffers for members who want to learn more and to fight back against anti critical race theory rhetoric, and to share information with other NEA members as well as their community members. He goes on to say this document, you can find it on the internet yourself, if you're interested in, is that we or to provide already created in-depth study that critiques empire, white supremacy, there is that buzzword again,
Hmm.
anti-blackness, anti-indigeneity, indigeneity, racism, patriarchy, cis heteropatriarchy, capitalism. So they want to critique capitalism, ableism, anthropocentrism, and other forms of power, of oppression, and the intersections of our society, and that we oppose attempts to ban critical race theory. This is what the National Association of Teachers says. We oppose attempts to ban critical race theory and or the 1619 project.
Right.
so, so,
Well,
so the
what's
goal
very
is indoctrination, really.
yeah, what's very fascinating about it is they will say, well, no one's teaching critical race theory in schools, and proclaim that there are no critical race theory books being taught in school, like Delgado's Introduction to Critical Race Theory, or, White Fragility, or,
Mm-hmm.
How to Be an Anti-Racist. These books aren't being taught in school, but what they're failing to articulate is that the books don't need to be taught in school if the teachers themselves have this critical race theory lens through which they
Yeah.
argue, teach or speak through every particular position through. So if their worldview is a critical race theory, worldview, um, they're going to reframe every bit of history, every bit of math, every bit of English, every bit of
Yeah.
philosophy, every bit of science through a critical race theory lens. So your students are no longer being educated in the reading, writing, and arithmetic. They're being educated into race, sexuality, feminism, and all these other issues through this critical lens. And it is a worldview issue. It is a thorough
Oh yeah.
worldview issue,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and I totally agree exactly with what you said. Of course, there are critical race theory books that have seeped their way into the, uh, the educational system, but this is an old tactic called Mott and Bailey tactic. A Mott and Bailey tactic is um, the Mott was from medieval times, where it was a lightly defended place where you would defend yourself, and you
Mm.
would kind of get your enemy to attack the Mott. This is a lower position, lightly defended, and when your enemy attacked the Mott, you would retreat to the high Bailey position, which is constructed.
Mm.
And what does that look
Yeah.
like in our time? You'll look at your television pundit who will say, you'll go on and you'll have a discussion about critical race theory, and they'll say no one's really teaching critical race theory. All the while they've been saying, whites are oppressors, and we need to, teach our kids about, white oppression in America. But the moment that you really talk about these things, they'll say, oh, well, we didn't really mean it. What we really mean is that you don't really want your kids taught about slavery or black
Yeah.
history.
Yeah. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
so they will argue with you on one sense, where they will have this position, this extreme position on race, and then the moment that you start arguing with them, they'll retreat to this other position, which is to say, "Oh, you just don't want real history taught in America," and
Yeah.
that's a tactic that they use in order to make you think that you're crazy, and
Hmm.
so that they can continue to indoctrinate rather than
Yeah.
educate children.
Yeah. Yeah. That's for sure. You know, I really think that critical race theory seeks to a transformation of society. I mean, they say so themselves. And I
Hmm.
think that transformation of society is one where, as Delgado talks about, that we question the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. And it just
Hmm.
seems to me that is really, the goal ultimately is to
Yeah.
transform society away from these liberal principles. you know, I
Yeah.
just have to share this. Ibram X. Kendi, he's one of the leaders in this movement. Here he proposes a constitutional amendment that would establish and permanently fund, excuse me, the Department of Anti-Racism, DOA. I think it's an idea that is DOA, dead on arrival.
Yeah.
But he wants, and it would be formally trained experts on racism and no political appointees. Oh yeah, sure.
Hmm.
But and the DOA would be responsible for pre-clearing all local, state, and federal public policies to ensure that they won't yield racial inequity, monitor those policies, investigate private racist policies when racial inequity surfaces, and monitor public officials for expression of racist ideas. The DOA would be empowered with political disciplinary tools to wield over and against policymakers and public officials who do not voluntarily change their racist policy and ideas. And it just sounds to me like it's the institute of thought, thought policing.
The
You
thought
know,
police, exactly.
yeah,
Yeah, it is. That is just sweepingly insane.
yeah, yeah,
That someone would suggest something so foolish, and if you really dig into what Kendi is asking for there, those people would be unimpeachable.
yeah.
You
Absolute
could you
power.
could you could not remove them from office. Their
Yeah,
pronouncements would forever supersede our constitutional republic. It is patently insane, and
yeah,
and that's the kind of people who want power in our country, and imagine giving them such power. You would never be able to unseat them, never be able to remove them from power, and it would forever
Mm,
change this country.
yeah.
Um, I was going to say this a little earlier, and I think this kind
Mm,
of goes with this whole section. I was reading an article some time ago, and the article was named "The Thinker for Our Times." The man whose thoughts and ideas are wielding power long after um, he died is a guy named Antonio Gramsci
yeah.
or
Yeah.
Gramsci. And Antonio Gramsci argued for something called cultural hegemony. In cultural hegemony, you instead of attacking, you know, the particular political parties, you attack the institutions, and you reshape, reimagine, and reform the institutions to turn them against uh, Western values. And in so doing, you weaken the entire structure of society. And that's actually what we're seeing right now, where our institutions no longer uphold, constitutional. Well, I shouldn't say no longer. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but they're struggling to uphold, constitutional values,
Mm,
the kind of liberalism to which the left and right would agree in the past. Standards, behavioral practice, all those sorts of things are being under attack because of this idea of cultural hegemony, where a few people, and notice a few people,
yeah.
achieve positions of power, and they populate those positions with people who think the way that they do, so that a
Mm-hmm.
few people ultimately topple our system. And that's kind of what's happening, I think, in our
Mm-hmm.
country.
Yeah. 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 That brings us to our last slide here. Is well, actually, second to the last, is that fundamentally many aspects of critical race theory are incompatible with Christianity. It rejects the idea of objective truth. It makes skin color most important. Racism and other isms are the most evil. It demands endless activism. It promises utopia. It divides humanity into hostile groups, oppressor and oppressed. It creates a new version of racism, that whites are
Mhm.
always racist, and the state is our savior. So, what can be done to challenge it is really what we want to just touch on very briefly. And I think that, get informed, speak out, share what you learn, join with others, take positive action, take legal action when necessary, and know what your
Mhm.
kids are being taught at
Exactly.
school, you know.
I would also
So,
add, we have to, as Christians, we have to uphold, to really develop a firm biblical worldview. We,
mm-hmm.
we ought to have a biblical worldview or biblical theology of race, that there's only one race, right?
Yeah.
If we start from that perspective, that there's only one race, then our real issue then isn't race. Our real issue is sin.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way that we're going to do away with sin in America, or to attack sin in America, is biblically. We're not going to be able to do that by using sinful institutions, man-made institutions, to
Yeah.
overturn what is really a spiritual affair of the heart, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we, of course, we want to be like Paul and affirm our rights as citizens. We certainly want to do that. I would never seek to undercut that, but primarily, you're not going to overturn these issues without evangelizing, without being the kind of people that God intends us to be, who will love their neighbors, tell their neighbors the truth, treat them with love and respect and dignity,
Yeah.
and those sorts of things.
Yeah. Maybe I can end with this particular slide here, where Benjamin Franklin said on September 17th, 1777, the delegates left the Constitutional Convention in Independence Hall in Philadelphia, and as they exited, Benjamin Franklin was asked, "What kind of government do we have?" "A republic," he replied, "if you can keep it."
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah, if you can keep it.
If
Hey,
you can keep it, how
yeah,
important are those words?
yeah, really. So we're almost out of time here, Leroy. Any closing thoughts as we wrap up?
My hope for all these videos that we've done is that, people they don't have to agree with me. They don't have to agree with you. They don't even have to agree with us. I just want them to think about, what we've said and compare it to what they've seen. And,
Mm-hmm.
for
Yeah.
those who do agree with us, I would say think better about this situation. Really become the people who God intends us to be so that we can weather, this storm. Because, the end isn't written yet, right?
Yeah.
And for those people who are new to this topic, I just want you to understand that both Kerry and I, we don't hate critical race theorists. I mean, they anger me for certain, but I don't hate them, and that I do love our country, and I think that I'm in agreement with Paul, who said God chose the times and places and their pre-appointed boundaries for people to live, so that we might reach out to God. So I do think that cities, states, and nations, they do matter, and to the extent that we can, preserve this nation as a place where God can be glorified, even though the entirety of the nation does not glorify God, but a place where God can be glorified, we want to endeavor to do that, not merely for ourselves, but for our children and grandchildren. So
Mm-hmm.
I hope that people will take these videos and think about them, and use them, for God's glory, and be blessed by them.
Amen. Amen. Well, thank you so much, Leroy, for taking your time to share with us these thoughts. And it's just my hope and prayer. I echo yours that people will be blessed as a result of watching this series. That's it for now, and bye bye.